Hello, my name is Dan Marek. I'll be your Ruby instructor for today's plant-based holiday sides event. I'm the director of plant-based culinary for Ruby, where I grade content in our plant-based classes and build classes for partners. I have a background in plant-based cooking, and I've worked in that field for the past 15 years for companies like Whole Foods Market, nonprofits like Whole Kids Foundation, many culinary schools. I ran my own vegan catering company and currently sit on the board of Slow Food. Today, we'll be talking about plant-based side dishes for the holidays and how you can use them. I'll feature a few of these recipes, and you can find them on the landing page for this series that we'll provide links to. You'll see that at the top of the question, linked at the top there. There's also a recording of this if you want to go back to it and view the recipes again. Those will be available probably in a day or so. Before we start our class on holiday sides, I wanted to have a couple housekeeping items. On the right-hand top of the page, you'll see a dialog box that says Add Question Here. And if you're inspired to ask a question or make a comment, just type it in and it'll make its way to the queue. You can see on the right-hand side of the page. You can upvote questions by hitting the heart-shaped icon in the individual questions, and we'll answer those with more votes a little bit sooner. So let's get started with our holiday sides. I love the holiday season because it brings people together and celebrates the diversity of our tables in one meal. The holiday season can easily turn into a time when decadence turns in to take over our plates. Having plant-based sides that the whole family can enjoy is a great way to be able to keep families happy and healthy. Now, what I'll typically do is take recipes and convert them from traditional recipes, making different ingredients in place of those that I might not want to use because they're not plant-based. You'll see a lot of that happening today, especially with something like butter, where I'm actually going to show you how to do a plant-based butter as well. So we're going to go over some of these recipes from beginning to end today, and I'll open it up to questions when we're done, and we can talk about making substitutions in the dishes that you have questions about, or any other questions about plant-based holiday sides. With that being said, let's move into the kitchen so I can show you some of my holiday favorites. We're going to start with the plant-based butter. Our ingredients are actually pretty simple. We're going to use a refined coconut oil, melted, an olive oil, almond milk, apple cider vinegar, nutritional yeast,
Just afraid to talk.
turmeric, and salt.
Okay, good.
We'll actually start out by adding the apple cider vinegar to our almond
You
milk
can see the lantern
to let
in
it
the oil.
curdle. What we're doing is turning this into a buttermilk. After mixing, we'll add our coconut oil into our blender. Next, we'll put in our olive oil, and we'll blend very quickly. After it's blended together, we'll start adding our other ingredients. We'll start with the buttermilk, then our salt, our turmeric, and then nutritional yeast. We'll seal our blender back up and blend it for a couple minutes until well mixed. The texture should be very smooth. I'll get out a couple mason jars and fill them up to the top. After I've filled them both, I'll put lids on and put them into a refrigerator until they've hardened up. After they've cooled, you can open it up and you'll see that it's solid. If you'd like it to spread a little easier, you can also get it out of the fridge a little bit before you're actually spreading it onto your toast. This next recipe, the Hasselback potatoes, is one featured on our Ruby list. We want to start out with about 2 pounds of small white potatoes. Now I love to use this trick with the chopsticks because Hasselback potatoes are cut just until you get to the very bottom, about 1/4 inch slices. Now the chopsticks ensure that you're not actually going to cut the potato all the way through, so it leaves them connected on the bottom, but split on the top just like this. Now you can continue that through the entire 2 pounds of potatoes until you're done, just putting them in a separate bowl. Next, I'm going to transfer my potatoes into a larger bowl to make it easier to toss the ingredients with. My ingredients are actually really simple. I have 4 tablespoons of melted non-dairy butter, 2 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil. I'm going to toss those around just to make sure that the surfaces of the potatoes get a little wet so the other ingredients will stick to them. Next, I'll put in some salt, a little bit of pepper, then I'll add some fresh thyme, and a little bit of chopped up rosemary. Now it's time to get out my sheet pan and place all the potatoes on the sheet pan. I usually like to start with the sliced side down to be able to make sure that the heat opens them up a little bit. Now we're going to put these into the oven at 375 degrees. We'll put them in for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take them back out to be able to flip them. Now they might stick a little bit, so I do usually like to take a spatula and put them underneath to scrape off a little bit. Now that we know they're not stuck to the pan, I'm going to go through each individual potato and flip them over so the caramelized side is up. Then we'll put them back in the oven for another 20 minutes until they're done. And you can see they split open quite well. I'm just going to use this spatula again to make sure that they don't stick onto the bottom, and then they're ready for serving. I'll just put them onto my plate and then right onto the table. Next, we're going to do our vegan crab cakes. This is actually an easy recipe as well. We're going to use chickpeas and hearts of palm as our main ingredients. I'll start by putting 1 can of garbanzo beans in. I'm going to save the liquid for later because we're going to need it for another part of this recipe. I'm just going to do a light pulse on this. I want to make sure definitely not to make this into a hummus, because I'm actually going to add in my hearts of palm next, so they'll be ground up a little bit more. So again, just a light pulse to make sure that you're looking for a crab meat-like consistency. Next, I'm going to get a large bowl out, and then I'm going to add the garbanzo bean liquid to this. About 4 tablespoons will do for our purposes. This is also known as aquafaba. So I'm going to take my whisk and start to whisk this until it gets a light foam into it. You can see it starts to foam up pretty easily. Now after that's done, I'm going to start to add my other ingredients to this. I'll add in a teaspoon of lemon juice, a 1/4 cup of vegan mayonnaise, 1 teaspoon of vegan Worcestershire sauce, I'm going to stir this up a little bit just to get everything mixed together. I'll add 1 tablespoon of dried parsley, 1 teaspoon of Dijon mustard, 1 teaspoon of garlic granules, 2 teaspoons of kelp granules, 1.5 teaspoons of Old Bay seasoning. We'll add 1/2 cup of green onion sliced and 1 cup of breadcrumbs. Next, we'll add our crab mixture, which is actually the hearts of palm and the garbanzo bean. You'll want to make sure to get this well mixed so all the ingredients are mixed together and evenly consistent. Now we'll get out a sheet pan, spray it down with just a little bit of light cooking oil, and then start to form the patties. I usually like to do about a hand-sized ball and then make it into a smaller patty just by pushing it down. About 3 inches wide will do. Now space them out well on your sheet tray so they're not touching. Now we'll put them into our oven at 350 degrees for 20 minutes. Afterwards, you want to take them out, flip them over, and put in for another 20 minutes. Now I'm just going to serve them over arugula with a little bit of vegan tartar sauce, which is just mayo, pickle, lemon juice, and then a little green onion on the top. Next, we're going to do a little bit of a riff on a potato patty. This is actually a Ruby recipe listed as Indian potato patties, or aloo ki tikki. We're going to start with just 1 bay leaf into some boiling water. Take about 4 medium-sized potatoes, peeled and then diced. I'll take that, put it into the water, and wait for it to boil. While we're waiting for it to boil, I'm going to get out another pan, add a little bit of oil to it, and then about 1/2 an onion, and start to saute until I get a little bit of caramelization on the bottom. Then I'm going to add some herbs to this. Now just because of the season, I'm going to make it thyme. So about 1 tablespoon of thyme, and then about 1/2 cup of frozen peas. Now once they've been heated through, I'm just going to put them into a side bowl and reserve them for later. Now I'm going to bring back my boiling potatoes. I just had them on a different surface right now. After they've boiled and they're fork tender, I'm actually going to strain them off and put them aside to let cool down and dry out just a little. Once they've dried, I'm going to take them and then mash them up with a fork or a potato masher. Make sure not to use a potato ricer because they'll get too thin and they won't stick together as well. So a potato masher is actually a perfect tool for this job. Next, I'm going to add my onion and pea mixture into this. Then I'll put in some salt and pepper. Just do it as you taste. I'm not actually going to use that entire amount, but this will work for what I need. You can always add more later. Now I'm going to fold this all together. I want to make sure not to mash it up too much because we still want to keep that nice texture to it. So try not turning it into a paste. Now next, I'm going to add a couple tablespoons of flour of your choice. For this purpose, I'm actually using a gluten-free version. And then I'll fold the mixture again. Now that everything's mixed, I'm going to get out a cutting board. And then I'll start to form my patties. After all my patties are formed, I'm going to put some cellophane over the top and refrigerate it for at least an hour. Then I'm going to put some oil in the bottom of the pan and start to fry the potatoes. As you can see, I put an onion in just on the top right, just to make sure that my oil was hot enough when I put my potatoes in. If you're wanting to do a no oil version of this, you can also make these in the oven. You can put them on a sheet pan at 375 degrees at 20 minutes per side. When you get them out, they might stick, so you will need to take a spatula underneath your sheet pan to let them release easily. As I'm taking them out, I'm putting them onto a wire rack next to this as well. Now, you want to be careful when you're flipping these, so I'm actually using a spatula and tongs, just to make sure that they're not going to break apart. Another great thing about this recipe is that these freeze very well. So if you want to make them in advance, you can actually cook them the night of just by putting them in the oven as well. I'm just going to plate these very simply and put a little bit of no oil mushroom gravy over the top. This is one of our Ruby recipes as well, and I'll show you the clip from the class right after this. So those were just a couple examples, and on that very last end, I actually used a no oil mushroom gravy. So this is one of the videos actually taken directly out of the classes. So we just wanted to show you as well, because this is a classic recipe that I pretty much make every year. So this is the no oil version. There is a version with oil as well, but this one works great. So here's the Ruby version of the no oil mushroom gravy.
To make the gravy, first prepare and gather your mise en place. To start, dry saute the onions over medium-high heat. Once the onions have softened and just started to brown, add the garlic, thyme, and rosemary. Cook for another 30 seconds or so. Then add the mushrooms and continue to stir. Next, deglaze the pan with the wine. Continue to stir to remove any brown bits from the bottom of the pan. Once the wine has reduced by about half, add the mushroom powder. Next, add the stock, followed by the tamari, vinegar, and nutritional yeast. Bring to a simmer over low heat and let cook for approximately 5 minutes. Then taste for seasoning, adding pepper, nutritional yeast, and/or tamari as needed. Lastly, prepare the slurry. Add a bit of stock to the flour and mix to combine. With the sauce at a simmer, add the slurry a bit at a time. Bring the gravy back up to a simmer before adding more of the slurry. This is the consistency you are looking for. The gravy coats the spoon nicely, yet it's not too thick, nor is it too runny. This wild mushroom gravy pairs well with many dishes. It even pairs well with a simple bowl of mashed potatoes.
All right, so those are just some of my favorites for some holiday sides. Now, I'd like to open it up to some questions for everybody as well. And as I'd said before, you can just put it on to the right side there and submit the question, and then just hit the heart symbol if you'd like to upvote the question. So our first question is actually from Holly. I just signed up today. Is there a way to see the video for part 1 so I can catch up? Yes, actually, if you see at the very top of the question area there is actually at the very, very top, there is a landing page that you can go to. And if you just click that into your browser, it'll take you to the landing page and you'll see all the recipes for today. But then you'll also see Barton's part 1 of this segment as well. It's been pre-recorded, or it's been recorded since he did it live. So you can actually just check that as well too. This one will also be recorded and will be available in a day or two as well too. So looks like Mary had the same question on that too. So great questions. You can just click on that link and it'll take you to the landing page, and all of the entire series will actually be there at least a day or two after they've been live as well. So great questions from everybody. So Kathy, how do you freeze fresh things like cilantro or basil so they aren't mushy when thawed? That's a great question. So cilantro and basil are great things to have in your fridge all the time. Now, if you're out of season, that can be a little hard, right? So what I typically do I'll freeze them in a couple different ways. My favorite way is to actually blend them up and put them into ice cube trays, just a little bit of water, so I can actually melt them out afterward. I have seen people, put them in baggies in a freezer as well, where they pick off the individual leaves and put them into baggies to be able to freeze. You definitely want to take them off the stems if you're doing that as well too. But if you're doing them in like the puree, like I talk about, actually typically we'll use some of the stems. For cilantro, I'm thinking. For basil, not as much. But if you're looking to be able to get just the perfect leaf of basil or cilantro, freezing isn't going to be an option. It's the texture is just going to be very different on those as well. So if you're freezing those herbs, I'm typically going to put them into a sauce or something like that, because you can still get the great flavor and the aromatics from them, but the texture is going to be different. So I'll, stir those into soups or sauces, or blend them up into some of those as well too. But great question on that as well too. Can you talk about making the dishes lower fat, even no oil, and low sodium while optimizing flavor? Yeah, actually, that's a great question. A lot of the dishes I did for this series in particular definitely had some full fat in them, but most of them could actually be done without oil as well. So, like the potato patties, like I was talking about, those are kind of a lot of oil in those, right? So the peas and the onions that I sautéed, I could have just done that in a no oil version as well. And instead of doing a fry in the pan, I could just do those thinner and put them in the oven. They'd still get a nice crispness. That would typically be about 350 degrees to be able to get that caramelization on one side, and you would have to flip them over. And I typically would try those for about 20 minutes and then flip them over, just like I did the crab cake version as well too. So those are a couple things to be able to keep the no oil versions on those. As far as other recipes for the holidays, just omitting the oil is typically something that usually works. Using the dry saute method or the steam method works really well to be able to get the full flavor of those vegetables. And then just use less salt. Salt is not something I typically use a lot in my own personal cooking. And even when I'm catering for stuff like that, I'll really use low salt as well. The key is just really using good ingredients. The highest quality ingredients you can find, the more flavor you're going to get out of them. The things that are in season more are actually going to have a lot more flavor to them too. So if you think about that, it makes perfect sense, right? Like if you pick a tomato in the middle of January and you're living in New Jersey, it's not really going to taste too much like a tomato, right? But if you grew that tomato in your backyard and picked it, it tastes unbelievably great, right? Because there's no, picking it and getting on a truck or a train for 7 days to get up to New Jersey in the middle of winter, because it's coming from very southern Mexico. The closer you buy the food to the source, the less time it's decomposed, and it has more flavor in it as well. So, getting locally sourced ingredients definitely would be the top of the list in season if possible. And then, if you're doing other things that are out of season, frozen and canned goods are actually always great for those too, because they're picking the produce at the top of its season. So it's actually a great time to get full flavor out of those without using any salt. And that's typically what I try to do, to be able to use less salt, and for using less oil or fat, just going with no oil and doing saute methods with water or other things like vegetable stock. Thanks for that question. So let's see. From P, would love to know about plant-based sides that can be prepped in advance and others that can be frozen too. So actually, a number of the ones that we did today actually all can be frozen. The potato patties freeze really, really well, and you can just bake them to bring them up to temp again. The gravy actually freezes well too. Just put that into a baggie. And then you can bring it out to thaw later on. So a lot of these things can be frozen ahead of time. In fact, there are a lot of these dishes for holidays that will work that way. Now, things that aren't going to freeze are your fresh, really fresh ingredient type things too, like your salads and things like that. Or if you have dishes that really kind of rely on the texture being just the way they are when you cook them, those are things you're not going to want to freeze as much ahead of time. But maybe part of the components you can prep ahead of time. So maybe like the gravy, you could do the gravy ahead of time because you're not really looking for too much tooth in your gravy. But then you could use that and put it over potatoes or use it in a pot pie or something like that as well too. So you can do some of the work ahead of time just to make it easier for you. Some of those things might work too as far as your mise en place, right? So if you can cut up your carrots and your onions ahead of time and do them in like a freezer bag in your freezer, maybe a couple days before you're prepping, you can get a lot of that stuff done ahead of time too. And that actually answers Annette's question too. How early can you start prep before the holiday? Annette, I am starting to prep now for my holiday season already, just because there are certain things that I know I'm going to make now that I could use later on, and it's going to make it easy. I do a lot of cooking in the family along with my mom, and to be able to have stuff prepped ahead of time, always wonderful to be able to make those things as far ahead of time as you can. So if you're looking to prep, start now. That's totally fine. If you've got a week ahead of time, or you've got a weekend off or something like that, always good times to be able to start getting some of the things ready for the holiday season. And a good thing to do is just kind of make a list of what you think you're going to make for the different holidays through the season. And then make a grid for it and see kind of what things you're going to need for when, and look at it and see what you can make ahead of time and what you can't. So it's a good way to be able to tackle the holidays, and make sure you get through those. So, Linda, I'm looking forward to your ideas and especially your suggestions for the main dish and how to make a holiday meal special. So, Linda, I didn't do any main dishes this time. We focus specifically on sides. But also at the top of the question link here, you can see I did put a link to my past holiday meals event. And actually in there is one of my favorites, which is a Portobello mushroom Wellington, actually, which is a great showstopper of a dish that I would highly recommend. So I would check that link out to be able to see. And it's, again, just kind of like the style where the Ruby style, where it's top down, and I walk you through the entire dish from beginning to end. There's also another one that on the Ruby set that I think is really good for the holiday season, which is the shepherd's pie. We have a garlic mashed potato and shepherd pie and its individual settings. So if you go to the recipes section on your page on the top right when you're logged into Ruby, you can look up the recipe. Just look up garlic mashed potatoes or shepherd's pie, and it'll give you the breakdown for those. But those are two really great crowd pleasers. The mushroom Wellington is just a beautiful dish too. So I would highly recommend that one as well too. All right, so Leslie, what is your must-have side dish for every holiday meal? Mine, especially, is mashed potatoes. Since I was a kid, I've always loved mashed potatoes, and that is definitely the side that I always do. So my mashed potatoes are very simple. I just basically use russet potatoes, little plant-based butter, some salt and pepper, put it through a rice masher, a potato ricer, after boiling them all and putting them into a bowl, and then maybe a little bit of herb garnish on the top of it too. So I can't do a holiday season without the mashed potatoes. And the great thing is I love to use the mashed potato leftovers too. So we'll make things like potato pancakes or the potato patties that you saw here. The one that I did in this video was a riff off of an Indian version that we have on the site, which is really, really good. I just wanted to kind of keep it in that holiday set. So I just used thyme and peas for that as well. But those mashed potatoes make a great egg, or a great potato patty, just in the same kind of a way too. All right, so Connie, what is the best healthy sweetener for baking, like pies and pastries? If you're looking for healthier, sweetener, my go-to is always dried fruit. Dates are probably the one that I use more often than any other, or dates, sometimes apricots as well. And I'll turn them into a date paste. So to make a date paste, you basically will throw the dates into a blender or a food processor, and then just slightly cover them with water. I actually do this in the blender most often, so I'd probably use that on that. So put them into your blender and just slightly cover them with water, and then blend until smooth. That actually makes a great sugar that you can use for baking that keeps things moist as well too. So that would probably be my highest recommendation for those. It works great for baking. Unfortunately, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. So it's not like 1 cup of sugar to 1 cup of date paste. There's definitely some experimentation that has to happen in that. So if you're making something like a banana bread or something like that, you want to test it maybe make some mini banana muffins or something like that ahead of time to be able to make sure you're getting your ratios correct on that as well. But definitely, the healthiest version that I can think of for a sweetener would be a dried fruit paste, because you're still getting a lot of the fiber along with it. It's not processed as much too. Great question though. Darlene, I have a gas oven. How does cooking multiple items at once affect roasting and baking? I understand that opening the oven equals heat loss, so I try to minimize this. Other than that, I would love to hear your tips. So that's a great question, Darlene. When you're doing a lot of different cooking in the same oven, you definitely have to keep an eye on it. So one of the things I always recommend for people is to get a thermometer that goes inside of their oven, so you can make sure that your oven is keeping at the temperature that it's saying. Just because it says 375 and the digital readout on the top doesn't mean that's exactly what your oven is at when it's in, in full mode. So keeping it closed as often as possible is better. The old saying, what is it? If you're looking, you're not cooking. So that's a great thing, is try to keep it, closed as often as possible. The other thing is timing. So like I was saying before, is making a sheet of what you're going to make for the holiday season, and look at what the timing is going to be for each one of those. Like, what dish needs to go on the top shelf, what needs to go on the bottom, how long do they need to cook, and do you need to be able to pull things out and put other things in? So if you get that timing just right, you're not going to be opening and closing the oven for each one of those. So coming up with a list to be able to organize your shelf space in your oven is always good, and then keeping a good thermometer in the oven to be able to make sure that you're keeping the temperatures at the expected rate of what it should be. Great. Let's see. Leslie with the holiday meal, I think I answered that, was the potatoes. Kathleen, can you make a quality reduction from pomegranate juice? Yeah, you can make a great reduction of pomegranate, or even like molasses from pomegranate. I've done it a couple times. Like, you could even do like the palm juice kind of a thing and put it in, and just put it low and slow basically, and just wait for it to reduce. I typically will aim for the halfway mark for pomegranate juice, and it's a great thing to be able to put over other things. Even cranberry dressing is a really good thing to be able to put that pomegranate reduction over. But there are a lot of things that you can use pomegranate reduction for as well. So yes, you can do that. Great family redo recipes for the holidays from your family. Love you, Dan Roberta. So that's my mom. Thanks, Mom, for putting that out there. I know you're visiting the grandparents right now, and we're talking about holiday stuff. So that's great to be able to see you on this. I already mentioned we do a lot of recipes together over the holidays, and you do a fantastic job of recreating them in a plant-based version. So thanks, Mom. Carlo, why do you add nutritional yeast to the butter recipe and the mushroom gravy? What's the purpose? So for the butter, it basically kind of gives it a little bit of that butter flavor-ish, right? So it's kind of that umami on the edge of it, but not like overly umami. So that's what I put it for in the butter for. You don't have to have it in there, but it definitely makes a little bit of a difference. So I usually add it to it. For the mushroom gravy, again, it kind of gives that creaminess, where a lot of gravies have a cream or something in that. So the that little extra bit of kind of cheese flavor and the umami to it, I think really works for it. There's so much umami in that mushroom gravy, though. You could literally go without it and it wouldn't be a big deal. So you can skip it on the mushroom dish, but definitely for the butter dish, I've done it with and without. So I would do it with on that one as well. All right. So Danielle, can you give a replacement for seeds, nuts, soy, garlic, and onions? I have food sensitivities to these foods, and many of the recipes include these stimulating foods. Would be great to be reminded of substitutes. Okay, so kind of depends on the dish, right, for each one of these. So the seeds and nuts, if you're just looking for the fat content, I would maybe look for like something like an avocado for the fat content in it instead. If you're doing like a cheese or something like that, you could kind of switch that up to some other vegetables. But again, that's a little hard to narrow down, because a lot of times you just substitute a seed for a nut instead of the nut for the seed. For soy, avoiding things like the tofu and tempeh, but you can still enjoy things like a soy sauce, but don't think of it as a soy sauce. Do like something like Bragg's liquid aminos or coconut aminos, right? So those taste very similar to a soy sauce, but there's no soy in those. Again, always read your ingredients on those too. And there are a lot of different kind of sauces that you can use instead of a soy sauce as well too. Now, garlic and onions on your aromatics, again, it kind of depends on what you're making into them. And I'm not sure if you have the same kind of sensitivities to things like leeks, there are a couple different things to be able to look at that. And that might be in the same family, because garlic and onion is in the same family. And I think you probably have the same sensitivity to those other ones as well. But not knowing exactly what you're allergic to, that's a little bit of a tough one, and depending on the recipe. Now, if it's something similar, like the recipes we did today, like the I don't know, like the crab cakes, right? We don't need the onions and the crab cakes at all. You can totally avoid those along with the garlic. And same with the other dishes that I was thinking of today too, right? So the mushroom dish we could do without the onions, and we could do without the garlic as well. Just skip those on those techniques, just as examples on those ones. If you have a sensitivity to it, just leave that, the onions out of it as well. For the nuts and seeds, I think it would need a little bit more specific recipe you're looking to replace those for. So I hope that helps, Danielle. All right, so Sherry, nice to meet you, Chef Dan. Let's talk rice. I love rice. Whenever I make rice, jasmine, brown rice, basmati rice, then inevitably it always cooks mushy and sticks together. I would like to see individual grains with only minor sticking together. Advice? Yeah, so that's actually a great question. Now, there are a lot of different ways to be able to cook rice around the world. The one that I've actually adopted that I like to use most is by rinsing my rice ahead of time. So, actually soaking my rice. So I'll actually soak my rice in a pot or a pan, doesn't matter how much water, for at least 15 minutes before I go to cook them. And then after soaking them, I'm going to dump them out into a strainer and then rinse them off until I see the water starts to come out clear. And then once that happens, I put it back into the pot. And then instead of being a 1 to 2 ratio, it's a little off. So for 1 cup of rice, I would use 1 3/4 of water. So that way it doesn't get so sticky on the inside, because I've been soaking them and, rinsing them like that, I think there's a little moisture that gets retained into them as well. So I do just a little bit less water than it calls for the 1 to 2 ratio. And it comes out where your individual grains every single time. And I think that's a great way. Now it's great to have the sticky rice as well too. And you can do that just by adding a little bit more water to it. And then the starches, if you don't rinse those off, will actually make it much more sticky as well too. So 2 things. One is soaking. The second one is rinsing off until the starch comes off of it. And that should really help you get the rice you're looking for there, Sherry. Hope that helps. Deborah, how long does your vegan butter last in the fridge? Well, any of the recipes that we typically show, we typically say about a 7-day period is kind of the top, depending on where you are. I've known that one to go much longer. It's probably 3 weeks or so. It could probably go longer as well too. So the recipe that I showed you there filled like 2 little jars of it, and that's too much for us to go through as a family. So I'll actually end up giving one of those away too, just because I don't want them to go over a month in my fridge. But typically, yeah, I would say 3 weeks at the very most. But the thing is you can tell right away if it's gone bad. It'll smell different, or you'll start to get a mold on top of it as well. So those are 2 ways to tell right away if it's gone bad. But otherwise, I don't have an exact answer for you. But 3 weeks, I'd say that's the point where you start checking on it on a daily basis. All right, so Mila, can you make the potato patties with edamame and not peas? Oh yeah, of course. That recipe, the way I did it, was made to be able to interchange with all kinds of other things. So edamame would be a great replacer instead of peas. You could do other beans in it too. If you wanted to do something like garbanzo beans or cannellini beans in it, that would work just as well. I just used peas in it because that was in the original recipe. And I thought it was like, okay, a lot of people like to have just the peas on the side of dishes, so let's just put it into as well. So if you want to do the peas instead, great idea. I would totally say go with that one to make it work for you. All right, so Teresa, is there a way to make mashed potatoes ahead of time? I've tried putting them in the crock pot or baking them in a casserole dish, but they either get gummy or aren't as fluffy. Teresa, I have to agree with you on that. Mashed potatoes being one of my favorite, dishes for the holiday season, I've never seen them come out the same way that they do if you don't just make them fresh on the spot. You can definitely make them ahead of time, but they're just not going to come out the same kind of fluffiness or the same texture that I think you're looking for. So unfortunately on that one, I would say just do it right from the get-go, right when you're making them. Again, what I'll do is I'll typically peel them, sometimes I keep the peel on, but I'll cut them into quarters or smaller, depending on the space I have, and boil them and then mash them. And I'll put a little bit of vegan butter, maybe a little bit of almond milk into them, and just salt and pepper. And that's pretty much it. I keep them really simple. But I do make it the day of and make it right away for it as well. All right. So, what's the purpose for the nutrition for Gerben? What's the purpose for the nutritional yeast in the gravy? Again, it's just kind of add that little cheesy flavor to it. It's just got a little bit of a different kind of flavor profile to it, but you definitely don't need the nutritional yeast in the gravy. It is added in the no oil version, but I don't think it's in the other one as well too. But it just gives a little bit of a different flavor profile, brightens it up a little bit, but also gives it a little bit of umami flavor too. But if you don't want it in there, you don't have to use it. Catherine, so what are your thoughts about monk sugar? I was surprised it was not reviewed one of the Ruby chart in the covered sweeteners. That's true. Monk sugar's fine. Oh, there's another one is monk fruit. Oh, from Kathleen as well. So monk fruit is great as a sweetener. I mean, it's become a little more popular more recently. Monk fruit is basically a fruit that was gathered by monks and kind of shaved down. It has a little kind of a bitterness to it at the front end of your palate. So typically I would pair it into things that have a little bitterness to it as well that you'd expect it. So like, what am I like pad thai, right? So if you're doing like a vegan style pad thai, you typically use something like a tamarind paste, which has that natural bitterness to it. And you want to put something sweet to be able to go along with that. So monk fruit is actually a perfect sweetener for something like a pad thai if you're doing a vegan style pad thai. It's a great thing to be able to use. I honestly haven't used it a ton because it's not really widely available. At least where I'm at, I'm not finding a whole lot of it. But with all the different diets and keto style, I guess it would probably fit into that bracket of alternative diets. So there's probably more of a surgence coming back that I just don't know about. But if you're getting monk fruit, great. It's definitely one of those ways to be able to add sweetness to a dish without, adding a whole lot of calories to it, still getting the fibers, to it. So, yeah, knock yourself out with the monk fruit. That's great. Rebecca, what delicious side dish options do you have that are whole food, plant-based, no oil, or no dairy? Wow, Rebecca, there are so many of them on the Ruby platform. If you go up after you're logged in onto the Ruby platform, you'll see a little tab at the top right that says recipes. And when you click on that, there'll be a host of recipes, thousands and thousands of recipes that show up. And on the left-hand side, you can actually put in your preferences of vegan, options, and then more whole food plant-based options there. So we have a huge amount of whole food plant-based, no oil, and no oil or no dairy options for side dishes to be able to do those. All of the ones that we did today can also be, done in that version, except for the butter is not, very whole food just because there's so much oil in it as well. But the other ones can all be done pretty easily. All right. I can't see the Portobello or Donnelly. I can't see the Portobello recipe on the Ruby site for the holiday recipe page. Is it somewhere else? So it is somewhere else. It's actually from a webinar we did last year. And here's the link for it. It's last year's holiday meals recipe. And that has the mushroom Wellington in it as well, too. And it's Laura saying can't find the recipe. So you know what, Donnelly or Laura or anybody else who's listening on this, if you email me, I will make sure to email you a copy of that recipe. Oh, perfect. Patrick, in my ear is telling me that the link here is actually the PDF for the recipes. So that's great. You don't have to email me. You can actually just click or if you copy that address, you'll find the recipe right there as well. And if you have a question about it, feel free to email me as well. You can always email me at dan@ruby.com. All right. So Lewis, hello, Chef Dan. I hope you had a good weekend. I did. Thank you. I hope you did too. If you had to make 3 side dishes for a couple people on a strict raw diet, what would you make and what equipment would you use as well? Well, that's a great question. So 3 side dishes for people that are strict, raw, no oil. Now, if I were thinking about that, there are a couple things that kind of come to mind. And if you're looking for side dishes in particular, maybe a nice raw cheese that's you could do a simple raw cheese, and we have a couple different recipes on our Ruby platform as well. And maybe do it with like a little like sun-dried or dehydrated tomato kind of underneath it as well too, would be kind of a fun little appetizer, kind of a side thing. You could put some pine nuts over the top or some pesto as well too. So for equipment you'd use for that, cheesecloth and a really good blender. A dehydrator if you want to do the tomatoes, but you don't have to do the tomatoes from scratch. You could also get sun-dried tomatoes as well too, but that would probably be an option. You might want to do something like, the first thing I thought of was the lasagna, but that's not a side. But I love to do a raw lasagna where I'll marinate like mushrooms and onions and peppers, and like a mix of like vinegar and tamari and water to be able to kind of infuse those flavors, and then do like a pesto and a bechamel sauce, all raw, of course. And then layer them in with some noodles, if you will, that you can do out of zucchini sheets or something like that. Oh, speaking of zucchini sheets, that's a great side too, is you could do a spiralized zucchini or a spiralized beet and also do a marinade with those too, and do a nice kind of like side salad or something you could do even with the noodles. But the side salad would be kind of a cool option with that as well too. Now, there are a couple other things you could do, like a cashew cream and put some other things, like zucchini kind of chopped up into it. So you get kind of a creamy little salad. You could also do some raw crackers or something like that with a little bit of, the cheese or something like that on top. You could do zucchini roll-ups, with different, you could do like a nut or a seed cream on the inside, maybe with a little bit of dill or something like that, and maybe wrap up some raw veg in that with some different really nice herbs, maybe a little bit of cilantro or fresh dill in there, and have those kind of wrapped up in the zucchini sheets like that, so they kind of stack up. Would kind of be a cool one. I saw a student the other day did a mango kind of sheet on a dehydrator and then wrapped in a raw Indian dish in it that was just fantastic. That student did a fantastic job of that too. Let's see. That's kind of a lot I gave you there. I'm not sure if I gave you, I think you only asked for 3 and I probably gave you more than that. So I think that should probably do for you. So I hope that helps for you. Marzita, so is there a way to add butter flavor to a simple mashed potatoes without using the vegan butter, trying to keep it whole food plant-based? Yeah, that I would probably do with the nutritional yeast as well too, because it does add a little bit of the umami, kind of flavor to it for the butterish that we're kind of looking for. So just putting a little bit of that into your mashed potatoes, I think would work just well. You'd have to whip it in pretty well too, to be able to make sure that those flakes kind of break down a little bit. Because a lot of times nutritional yeast will come in large flakes. So try to look for a smaller flake nutritional yeast on those as well. Because the butter's nice in it, but you don't need it if you're trying to keep it whole food plant-based as well. Great question. So Sandra, for the garlic mushrooms, is there something else beside mushrooms I can use? I'm allergic. So instead of doing the garlic mushrooms, you could do something else that's kind of in that simple, the flavor profile is that garlic, and that the herbs that you're looking for. So you could also do zucchini, so if you cut the zucchini like in half lengthwise and then did another half in lengthwise and then chopped it into kind of smaller triangles, that would actually be a great conduit for that kind of garlic sauce in that one as well too. And it's going to have this similar kind of a texture as well. You just want to try to make sure not to get too many zucchini with too many seeds in them as well, which is actually a trick too that I just learned from Jacques Pepin, which is wild, where you can look at the end of it, and if it's flowering out, I think it was. I'll have to look that one up again, but there's a really cool trick that you can find if it's a male or female zucchini, and you typically want to try to pick the male zucchinis that have a little less seeds in them as well. So Alona, can you share the best options for a gluten-free baking? And if you're not celiac patient, only gluten intolerant, can you eat Enkworm or Vital Wheat seitan products? So I'm not a doctor, so I can't tell you exactly that this is it, but I do know that Vital Wheat gluten is 100% gluten. So if you have a gluten intolerance, you don't want to use Vital Wheat gluten products at all, because that's just, basically just concentrating the gluten in that as well. Now, the other product you said was the incorn. If my memory serves me, that's like an ancient grain of wheat. And it's really interesting because I've heard different things on this. When I was in Italy last time, I went to a place where they were doing pastas with an ancient grain wheat, and people that had full-on celiac disease were eating it, and I was just shocked. Now again, that's on an individual basis. That's not going to work for everybody. So I would expect the inkhorn would have gluten in it because there is gluten in it. But over the years, gluten has been messed around with so many times by scientists that it's really what I think has led to the gluten intolerance and celiac disease. So looking at an ancient grain might help a little bit. So yeah, I wouldn't experiment with that too much unless you had a doctor around. So me not being a doctor can't tell you what those. So options for gluten-free baking, though, I can give you tons of options for those. Like garbanzo bean flour is one of my top go-tos. You can do rice flours, potato starch flour is a great one as well. Oat flour, super affordable. You can basically make it just out of oats by putting oats into a blender and turning it down into a flour, which is great as well too. Now it kind of just depends on the baking you're doing as well to be able to do that, but there are a host of gluten-free products and flours out there specifically for different things. So you can even find like 00 gluten-free options now, which is great. So yeah, that's probably what I would suggest, is doing a little bit of see what recipe you're looking for, what recipe they're asking for. If they're asking for a semolina or if you're asking for a 00, there are different options you can buy for those as well too. All right, so I hope that helps, Alana. And where can you find kelp granules? Kelp granules typically can be found in the Asian aisles of grocery stores. You might find them in like a little jar or something like that, but it's basically a seaweed, so you can find kelp pretty easy. And if you can't find kelp granules, you can blend down kelp down into granules as well. But I know that I think it's Eden makes one that's pretty widely available at different stores and standard grocery stores. You can also go to Asian markets as well, which will typically have those in a wide variety of different versions too. So I hope that helps. Tammy, will picky traditional eaters also enjoy these plant-based side dishes? Yes, they will. Depending on what they're picky about. But yeah, I mean, traditional eaters, a lot of the dishes we talk about throughout this entire series and the ones we've done in the past, most people don't even realize that they are plant-based. So most of these I've always served, and people have not even known the difference that they were plant-based or not. So depending on how picky they are, if they're picky and they won't eat things just in normal dishes, that's a whole other story. But most of these dishes, nobody even knows the difference for them as well. So Marina, easy tips to make dishes gluten-free due to celiac. So that kind of goes back to my question, or the question before. There are a wide variety of options for gluten-free now. So typically all of them are 1-to-1 ratios, and some of them need to be able to combine some different flours, but I would definitely look at garbanzo bean flours, rice flours, potato starch flours, oat flours are kind of the top ones that come to mind right away regularly that I use to be able to make things gluten-free. Nicole, can you suggest a veggie-friendly main course for the holidays? Yes. If you look at the link up on the top, which it might have disappeared by now, let me add it back in here for you. There is a webinar I did last year on holiday staples, and one of them is a mushroom Wellington, which is super great. So that would be a great one that I would recommend as well too. Natsaguli, sorry if I'm totally butchering your name. I'm sorry about that. And the mushroom gravy, can we substitute the flour with tapioca? Yeah, you can. In fact, there's not a whole lot of flour in there to be able to thicken it up, but you could skip it if you wanted to. Tapioca would work, but you might get some interesting results on it. I would probably suggest another one of the gluten-free flours that I'd mentioned before, like a garbanzo or rice flour, to be able to get it thickened up. The tapioca absolutely will, but there might be kind of a jelliness texture to it, as tapioca tends to do. So you could use it, but you might want to use it sparingly at first and see how it goes. So great. Davey, so excited for this subject. Thanks. I'm glad you're excited about it, and I hope we answered a lot of your questions for it. Marzita, I see you're hungry, so am I. If you're talking about food this much, that sounds wonderful too. So Donna, it's our last question here. And any absolute no-nos for using the vegan butter? What applications would it not work? Obviously pastry, but what else? For vegan butter, you have to consider that it's oil, right? So any vegan butter you buy, if it's at the grocery store or anything like that as well, you have to remember that it's basically an oil. So when it melts down, it's going to be oil basically at its core again. So anything that you can think of in that same kind of category that you wouldn't use for that would probably be there too. Now, I'm trying to think of some applications like a galette, right? So a galette being just a simple, it's a pastry dough and butter kind of a thing. Like that's not something you typically use a vegan butter for. I've used vegan butter before, but I use a really high-end baker's butter for that. Like the butter that I showed you guys how to use today is just kind of like more of a table butter. It's not for doing baking in particular. So if you are looking to do some of the baking techniques with the butter, I would actually buy a higher end butter if you can find it. I know Fran is going to be doing a session on vegan desserts in this, and she is an expert on vegan butters. We've had a lot of conversations about the best brands to use. So I probably would bring that question back up to her for those as well. But think of the butter that I made today as more of a table butter instead of like a baking butter, just to clarify that a little bit. I'm glad you brought that up as well too. So thanks, Donna, for your question. And it looks like that's all of our questions for the day. So thank you so much for joining us on our holiday meal part 2, plant-based side dishes. My name is Dan Marek, and thanks for joining us.